Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. In this video I'm going to be taking a look at both Homefront games, both the 2011 linear shooter and the open world shooter from last year. Both games have the same theme, the same enemy, but they couldn't have more different executions and different results. Let's take a look. Homefront came out 5 years ago, but I'm still irritated about it. It's a derivative mess of bad ideas and worse implementation. The campaign is barely 4 hours long, and what little there is rips off Modern Warfare 2 shamelessly. This game came out in 2011, Modern Warfare 2 came out in 2009. Homefront is worse in every regard. It looks worse, it plays worse, and its haphazard and stunted plot makes even less sense than the convoluted nonsense in Modern Warfare 2. Each pull the same emotional thread, though. America is under attack, a catastrophic land invasion that'll have the player fighting in suburban streets and cul-de-sacs where "Remember the Taco King" is a rallying cry of 21st century patriot warriors. Modern Warfare 2 uses the Russians as the big scary invader, the same way the cult classic hit Red Dawn did in 1984. Homefront, though, tried to one-up them, and got the director of Red Dawn, John Milius, to come in and help with world building. He's credited with the script, but in a Gamasutra post-mortem on the game, it's made clear that Milius didn't actually write any dialogue for Chaos Studios. He was just an idea man, and a back-of-the-box bullet point feature. It suckered me in at the time. I wanted a Red Dawn game, and Homefront was being marketed as one. But it wouldn't reuse the Russians. Instead, the game would bend over backwards to make North Korea the villains. Kind of makes creative sense, seeing as North Korea is the last living example of a Soviet-style military dictatorship. China was floated around as an antagonist early on, but publisher THQ didn't want to hurt international sales or risk a rebuke from China's media bureaucracies. The Cold War's us versus them mentality is a distant memory now. Even though China and the US are competing superpowers with competing ideologies, there's too much economic interdependence to make the Red Dawn scenario Homefront's going for marketable to an international audience that, notably, does include the Chinese and not the North Koreans. It's strange to think of a game's plot being altered because it would be diplomatically rude in the real world, but that's exactly what happened. The funny thing is, Modern Warfare 2's stupid but simple tweak to the Russians, "Oh, they're ultranationalists, just a bunch of real jerks," works so much more casually than the convoluted chain of events that Homefront uses to make North Korea the successful oppressor of the American continent. A lot of idea man John Milius' concepts from Homefront would get rolled directly into the 2013 Red Dawn remake, which also framed North Korea as the aggressor, to just as awkward a critical reception of the idea. The Soviet-Korean swap was for the same reasons, too. Not enough of the audience even remembers the Soviets for them to be effective villains anymore, and framing China as a one-dimensional villain is a guaranteed method for a media company to lose international business. Some critics liked it, though. Homefront has a Metacritic average of 70, with 8 separate outlets giving it 80 or above. I spent a lot of time trying to puzzle out why. In some ways, this is a very detailed and meticulously constructed game. In other ways, it is guiltier of what people see as the prime excesses of Call of Duty, with scripted events outweighing tactical choice, with an obligatory vehicle level, with slow-mo room breaches, with death from above air support segments, than any single Call of Duty game ever was, because it's trying to outdo a bunch of Call of Duty games in one go, and failing at it spectacularly. It is so single-mindedly derivative that it slams the door shut on the fingers of the artistry that does earnestly try to slip through the cracks. Homefront doesn't trust the player to do anything themselves, and that's the biggest problem, mechanically at least. Call of Duty is infamous for big segments where follow, wait is the only mechanic in use. Homefront is a much worse offender. At 4 hours, it's about the shortest I've ever seen in a big-budget campaign shooter, and fully 1 to 2 of those hours is going to be predominantly follow, wait, interspersed with, in the other 2 hours, follow, clear arena, follow, wait. The levels are linear to the point of glaring cheapness, where they tether the player to an NPC just to make sure that the player winds their way through the most circuitous route possible to make the level seem larger than it is. That's supposing you don't straight-up backtrack through portions of the level, too. Even though there are only 7 missions, almost all of them involve some degree of backtracking. If not obvious backtracking, then the kind I described earlier, where the linearity of progression curves you from one side of the building to the other side later on, so that the space of the level is used with greatest resource efficiency. I've never seen a shooter before, or since, that has such a small number of long, convoluted missions. Functionally, you're just walking from one set piece to another while your companions argue gruffly about who's the maddest at the Koreans. The shooting is mechanically the same as Call of Duty in the flattest way possible. It copies the interface, copies the weapon variety and encounter types, like spawning enemies until an advancement point is reached, or having to snipe guards in a predetermined order, but it has none of the momentum of spectacle that many Call of Duty titles leverage from their level design. The intention is the same, but there are key differences in how the spectacle is accomplished that lets Call of Duty succeed. Call of Duty has huge set-piece moments that draw the player's attention by commanding it, visually. Effort is made to frame the combat landscapes against vistas the player comes across naturally that show you what's going on from a variety of angles. They put great detail into background environments, so there's a consistent feeling of environmental realism and specificity. It seems like you're in a unique place, and then you globetrot to many distinctive and detailed places in which to fire underbarrel grenades. Homefront, though, is much more limited in scope. It's got the town of Montrose, a survivalist camp, a helicopter patrol through central California, then the Golden Gate Bridge. That's it. Its shortness seems to have created a paranoia about the player's agency. If you let the player dictate the pace, they'll burn through the game way too quickly, probably closer to 2 hours than 4. So you are always tethered to your NPC companions, and at their mercy for advancing through the level. They will direct your attention to what to look at. They will literally tell you to slow down and pay attention to what the game wants to show you. They'll tell you when enemies stop respawning and when it's okay to move on. While the same criticism can be leveled against many individual moments in the Call of Duty franchise, in aggregate, they often allow for a much greater variety of approaches than anything in Homefront. It's not just linear, it is suffocatingly linear, even for a Call of Duty clone. It's a guided tour of violence, war crimes, and bargain basement gunplay. Follow weight is the biggest problem in the gameplay, but it's the biggest problem in the script as well. You have no character, no voice, no personality of your own in the game. You follow, and you wait. So the game presents you with ethical dilemmas, like your commanding officer Connor deciding to use white phosphorus shells on the enemy, which is a pretty serious war crime, and then everyone just rolls with it. Connor says it's necessary, so we're doing it. Brianna, your other main companion, does argue with him about it to try and represent the two sides of the burn people alive, don't burn people alive coin, but there's no choice involved. And the strange thing about it is that it's genuinely only for show, for the plot to get edgy and gritty, because it kills a parking lot full of North Korean soldiers, but you could have taken them all on yourself based on the game's internal logic of how many people the three of you routinely kill. The passivity of the player's role in both the plot and the gameplay really chafes. It's a dumb plan. It's a genuinely cruel and inhumane plan, and all it does is save you like 60 seconds of gameplay, and you're morally complicit in it. Some of the white phosphorus gets misfired and lands on a resistance position, killing many of them. You're complicit in the plot in that too. But Connor goes through the rest of the level not really too worried about it, with Rihanna chiding him ineffectually. As you shoot your way back through the burning electronics store, Connor shouts, "Thought I smelled Korean barbecue," with a chuckle, and this gets a mild rebuke for being, an awful thing to say. But what's it matter? Connor's in charge. Connor's plan succeeded anyway, and Connor is pretty much the story's hero all the way through, despite this incredibly ham-fisted attempt to inject moral ambiguity into the equation. At the very end of the game, Connor valiantly sacrifices himself by charging into a Korean troop position with a targeting flare, lighting them all up for an airstrike. See, he wasn't such a bad guy after all. He was willing to die for what he believes in, too. He's a real patriot. We can all put that silly war crime business behind us, right? There's also Hopper, your Korean-American tech guy, who's there to diffuse some of the potential racism of a fully ethnic us-versus-them mentality. Hopper's also a relatively compassionate and moral character, probably the best in the game, but he doesn't do much besides half-heartedly implore Connor not to kill absolutely everyone. When trying to secure a helicopter from a survivalist camp, Connor and Rihanna even specifically ask Hopper to stay behind since he's Korean, and that'll make it harder to negotiate. Although negotiations break down anyway. There's an interest in the script in asking hard questions about racism and moral compromise in the face of war and invasion, but it just poses the questions and then continues forward with a 1990s action hero's self-confidence and the way they all excuse their escalating violence and the escalating retaliation against civilians in response. There's a scene where, once the resistance starts to gain a foothold over the invaders in Montrose, the North Koreans call in airstrikes against the civilian population. You watch helicopters destroy a suburban neighborhood from a hilltop. So this is our fault, right? Hopper notes with some accuracy. "Shut up," Rihanna says, and Connor puts the conversation to rest by saying, "We're moving on." Hopper wouldn't say anything if the developer hadn't wanted to note the moral ambiguity of what they've done, but if the developer had actually wanted to have a genuine conversation about it, they could have written that in too. Could have, but didn't. Homefront starts you out with a bus ride of horrors. In the first Modern Warfare, credits roll over a sequence where you're transported in first person through a city in chaos, with mass executions in the streets and armies swarming through the plazas. Same deal here, with even the same escalation of violence from the hooded, huddled prisoners to the inevitable piles of limp bodies lying in heaps, except instead of being shot in the head and switching perspectives at the end of the tour, your boss is hit by a resistance ambush, overturned, and you're handed a pistol and welcome to the fight. Haven't the past 240 seconds shown you what monsters these North Koreans are? Go on and get 'em! Take back the homeland. Just don't ask any questions whatsoever or express any autonomy. There's another game that puts you in the role of a terrorist fighting an oppressive state that handles it more gracefully, and that's Red Faction Guerrilla. Guerrilla's great fun, and being deliberately cartoonish in its approach allows that. The Earth Defense Force is just as corrupt and evil as the Koreans in Homefront, but the emphasis is on fighting them in gamified ways. Your revolution is literally a game of control points and side missions, with major emphasis on architectural damage. It's bad to hurt civilians, but only numerically. You get points taken off for it, and you can make those points back pretty easily. Guerrilla fundamentally acknowledges that if you're making a piece of media whose emotional goal is fun, you should not aim for moral ambiguity. You aim for a cartoon world of good and bad where the revolution's virtue is an equal match to the regime's vice. And Guerrilla has a voiced protagonist. The player still has no say in how the plot progresses, but at least Alec Mason takes responsibility for what occurs in the plot. Homefront goes for the edgy, in war there are no heroes approach that you can see in a movie like Fury, which portrayed the American tank crew as having real darkness within them, teased out and intensified by the horrors of war. The problem is that a movie's distance between audience and character, the passivity of watching it and not participating in the drama, allows for a lot more nuance in the portrayal. You can feel more ambivalent about how the boys from Fury conduct their war, and have that come through as the artistic intention than you might in a video game. What they do is more obviously separate from how you're expected to feel about it. In Homefront, there are token disagreements with Connor's bloodthirstiness, but none of it really matters in the face of the fact that Connor is your virtual tour guide, and what he does, you do. Homefront is ultimately just as cartoonish as Red Faction Guerrilla, but instead of making it a brightly colored game from top to bottom and using that artificiality to dial back the moral consequence, it shows you that the North Koreans are so irredeemably genocidal that whatever you do in the name of revolution is not wholly unjustified. Which is, funny enough, a very North Korean thing to do. Much of their propaganda is spent showing Americans as baby-eating capitalist monsters who would sell our own mothers for a fancier car, so practicing all day to stab us with bayonets feels comparably reasonable to the average North Korean citizen. Red Dawn was a collision of cultures, the authoritarian Soviet regime finding roost in the friendly neighborhoods of small-town America. The protagonists aren't soldiers, they're teenagers. They fight because they have to. And at the end of the movie, the Soviet commander has a clear shot to kill the ringleader, but he doesn't take it. They're not all monsters, the Soviets. It's the war that makes monsters of them all, despite themselves, and there's always a chance to back down even for the worst of them. Homefront doesn't have the nuance and consideration of Red Dawn, and that's a hefty condemnation because this is the same movie where Patrick Swayze's dad grips the chain-link fence of an internment camp, yelling, "Avenge me, son! Avenge me!" Then there's the stakes and scale of the conflict. Almost the entire town of Montrose, Colorado is massacred over a few tanks of gasoline. I'm pretty serious. Your character is a helicopter pilot. That's why the Koreans are taking to the camps at the beginning, because you have a wartime skill that both the rebellion and the Koreans want. What the resistance wants is to steal some gas, blow up the wall the Koreans have built around the town, and then get that gas to what's left of the U.S. military as they prepare to push into San Francisco. That's what happens, and that's all that happens. Your actions in Montrose, the actions that lead to the massacre of the entire civilian population, are solely centered on finding gas for tanks. It's just about the flattest possible arc for the plot to follow. There are other events, but the shortness of the game and the fact that your objective never changes makes them feel entirely tangential. You're introduced to the community of Oasis, for example, living off the grid and under their own laws, a little slice of traditional Americana hidden in the rubble. But not even an hour passes from when you're introduced to the community via a slow walking tour to their grisly deaths at the hands of the Koreans in retaliation for your actions. Everything in the game feels like it's on an accelerated plot schedule. It's closer in length to a movie than a show, but because it's a game and you're mostly just pew-pewing your way through abandoned cul-de-sacs, it has maybe a third of the story beats that a movie would actually have. And so you have things like the bus tour at the beginning, condensing years of brutal oppression into a digestible chunk, and Oasis, which they hold up before the player like a puppy with a bow before bringing the hammer down on it. It's cheap. Most of the storytelling is cheap. The survivalists are murderous fascists and racists, torturing Korean soldiers for sport. That's bad, obviously, going too far. So you get to shoot these people, but only after they go back on their word to you. If they'd just given you the helicopter, there would be no stand against them on the principle of the thing. It's an atrocity tacked on for flavor in the plot and extra motivation for the player, a kind of both sides can be awful equivalency that might have actually been powerful if Connor had suffered a meaningful consequence in plot, gameplay, or perception for his own crimes. But he didn't. It's just a welcome break, ultimately, to shoot 3 varieties of guys in short sleeves after spending so long shooting the same guy in combat armor. The game feels like an amusement park ride based on cable television. More time is spent dwelling on the loss of your tank, the Goliath, than on the retaliatory massacres. Your emotional connection to the tank is greater anyway. At some point in each of the first 4 missions, that stupid tank will save you from some calamity or another, revving over the horizon in the nick of time. I can't think of a better example of Homefront's poor design priorities than its constant use of tank ex machina to advance the level from one boring arena to the next, doing the killing on the player's behalf because it looks cooler when the game does it. The final mission is one of the only ones I really enjoyed, on account of how well its goofy and muddled patriotism actually comes together at the end to create a very Red Dawn kind of pulp moment. It's as blunt as a shovel to the face, but the rhythm of the level is on point for once, and the environmental detail is actually quite beautiful. Call of Duty itself would later have a more technically impressive Golden Gate scene in Advanced Warfare, but Homefront's last level does have a kind of plodding triumph to it that worked for me, despite myself. It's in connecting to the regular army and performing what feels like a genuine military action that makes it work. Advancing alongside tanks and pushing back a foreign invader on a famous landmark is the kind of pulpy, colorful fun that the game could have focused on over its relentlessly self-conscious edge and had it work better. Consider the strategy game World in Conflict. That game uses the real Cold War as a background, and as a consequence, the invasion actually makes sense. It takes its characters seriously and takes war crimes seriously. Connor's war crimes are glossed over in Homefront, forgotten. Bannon's war crimes in World in Conflict aren't. They dog him right up until the end, and his sacrifice is genuinely redemptive because he's been such a coward and such an ineffectual officer up until that point. Bannon shares Connor's action movie approach to combat, but everyone in World in Conflict thinks that Bannon is a complete schmuck because of it, in the more realistic world building of that game. Connor's sacrifice at the end of Homefront is just one more action movie thing for him to do in a long line of action movie cliches. It feels like the turning point in the game, though, like a new chapter was about to begin after this decisive tide-turning battle. If it had gone on, deeper into the war, with Connor out of the plot's way, with something other than gasoline heist to carry you forward, it would have finally built to the point where I was interested again, despite all the ham-fisted nonsense that had come before. They had, finally, finished a level that actually did have the Call of Duty vibe they were trying so shamelessly to reproduce. Then the game ends, right there. A radio announcer talks about how this might turn the tide for a beleaguered America, etc., fade out. Having a competent final mission, though, just underlines how outrageously poor the previous ones were. It's not because they didn't have the right artists, because the art is consistently good. The effects are detailed, the textures crisp, the lighting more subtle than anything in the script. It's because they tried so hard to make a blockbuster cinematic action experience that they didn't even trust the player to actually fully participate in the game, lest they miss something that was expensive to put on screen. Red Dawn presented a Republican power fantasy, sure, but it was an aspirational one that believed in the endurance and compassion of the American character. The Soviet commander knows he's gone native in Colorado when he won't shoot the teenage rebel. Homefront uses violence and atrocity as grit to sell the vibe, and it adds up to something that says nothing about either North Korea or America, nothing about morality in war, nothing other than that if you're in a bad situation, you should probably wait 60 seconds for the remote-controlled tank to come in and save you. Now, it's fair to point out that Homefront went through development hell to even get released. Its design by committee feel could simply be due to the fact that it was revised from boardrooms down several times over. But it didn't have to be this way. Its unexpected, potentially unwanted sequel goes in a completely opposite design direction and succeeds in ways that this first game never did. This is despite the fact that history repeated itself with Homefront: The Revolution's production. The new Homefront game also went through several shifts in publisher and developer before finally being released as a slightly melted, overbaked thing, just like the original. The sequel starts off on a much more solid foundation. It knows that he can't have a game about a new American Revolution if you don't give the player any damn freedoms. It kneecaps itself because the only freedoms it gives you are navigational and tactical. The Revolution is just as bad as its predecessor about delving into the psychology of evil and the morality of revolution without actually doing much more than drawing your attention to the themes. The key difference, the thing that makes Homefront: The Revolution a genuinely worthwhile game over the original, is its disinterest in linear progression and design. The plot is still bombastic and cinematic, with a lot of money and effort put into it, but this is a 30-hour or more game with gigantic open-world neighborhoods that warrant that level of exploration and time investment. Post-invasion Philadelphia is no guided tour. It's a fully participatory dystopia. It shares the same general setup of a technologically superior North Korea invading after shutting the US out of the technology they'd been selling us in the game's fiction, but the way North Korea is portrayed makes them a much more believable villain than the first game. They obviously don't have the numbers to hold either the city or the country, so they use terror and technology to keep the population in too much fear to rise up and overwhelm them. The walled city of Montrose, Colorado in the first game made little sense, and there was no perspective on the broader war. In the Revolution, the occupation has had years to settle in and find solutions to controlling the city, and all of those solutions are oppressive and inhumane. It's very unlike the first Homefront in how it builds its world. There is a strong sense of past history and past abuses, and a present of snowballing rebellion that unfolds across every neighborhood you fight in. The neighborhoods are categorized in a way that's reminiscent of how the U.S. divided Baghdad. There's the green zone, the heavily fortified heart of Korean occupation, the yellow zones in which some form of regular life persists under strict military rule, and then the live-fire red zones, where the fighting is constant and the bodies lay where they fall. The green zone, you never do get to assault in an open-world way. There's a climactic strike into the heart of it towards the very end of the game, but 95% of the core experience is in the red and yellow zones. The red zones are pretty self-explanatory in how they work. If you're seen, you're shot at. If you shoot back, you're pursued. Cause enough trouble, and the riot suppression Zeppelin moves in. Meanwhile, there are scattered objectives called strike points, and they come in many flavors. Like Red Faction Guerrilla, Revolutionary Progress is tracked on a variety of metrics, an overall percentage of neighborhoods seized, and totals of individual objectives accomplished. Blow up an armored car? Move the Revolution 2% forward. Topple a KPA stronghold? Move the Revolution 5% forward. Homefront: The Revolution bites off more than it can chew as far as its narrative themes go, but unlike the first Homefront, the plot is only a supporting pillar of the core game. The core game is neighborhood after neighborhood of combat and exploration puzzles. I can't think of a single thing that Homefront: The Revolution does uniquely. It is just as derivative of popular genres and game design fads as its predecessor. The big contrast is that it does these derivative things with confidence, skill, and flair. You can play a Far Cry game and get a similar experience, but you'll get the great outdoors in a Far Cry game, a huge region with a looser feel. Homefront: The Revolution is condensed and urban from start to finish, a fight for the city that really is block by block. The sheer variety of tasks and the fact that they're layered in such a dense and vertical environment lets the player create their own pace, and that's the most engaging thing about the game. It's massive. It contains a lot of combat options, a lot of objective variety, and some of them are loud, some of them are quiet. It's pretty easy to tell a combat and exploration objective apart. One's going to have towers, ramparts, guards, searchlights, and the other will be an unlit building with inconvenient doors. I usually hate jumping puzzles, hate them pretty fiercely, but something about these ones clicked with me. It might be the environmental design. This particular digital Philadelphia is the most detailed, dense video game city I've seen since Dying Light's Haran. It has a similarly intense level of casual detail. Broken hallways and crumbling buildings are beyond old hat in video games, but these feel detailed and real enough to still inspire curiosity about what's at the other end, despite being so similar to years of similar hallways that I pointed a digital rifle down before. The game doesn't try so hard as the original Homefront to be dramatic outside of the story missions. It's a gamified Revolution, where the game's systems feel more satisfying in their electronic frivolousness. It's casual. If you die, you can always try again, or try a different tactical approach, or abandon the attempt and go to a different sort of objective entirely. Lives are not actually at stake. There's no cowardice in retreating from battle to drive motorcycles up staircases. The revolution of the revolution is just thematic, the way the gameplay is organized and given context. Your role as a revolutionary guerrilla is primarily felt through the rhythms of combat. Strike points encourage speed. Once you've been detected and fired a shot, reinforcements will pour into the area until your objective is complete or you die. Killing everyone just buys you time to complete the objective, which makes the pace of combat feel appropriate to being the underdog. Strike fast or be overwhelmed. They have the power, they have the strength, they have the defenses, but you get to tear that all down, piece by piece. The fundamental setup is so satisfying as a game, as a 30-hour quest to liberate every neighborhood, to complete every strike point, that the absurdity of the North Koreans being the oppressor doesn't feel as vividly ridiculous as it did in the original title. It works. As an open-world dystopian cops and robbers, it works. And it works because a lot of love was put into the game, to the point where they even felt comfortable apologizing for it at the end. Once the credits begin to roll, this note from the game director comes up. It talks about how unlikely it was that this game ever saw the light of day in the first place, and how proud they were to have created such a large game with such a small team. When the game opened, I might have seen this as an admission of failure. Right before the title screen, the Resistance leader murmurs, "What a fucking mess." And after the first game, I expected a fucking mess to be exactly what I saw. Then the game actually set me loose in its world, and I started having a ton of fun. This is one of the biggest problems with games like the original Homefront that have a straightforwardly cinematic approach. In its effort to control the player's attention, Homefront 1 shattered its internal realism. The whole war is nothing but a pageant put on for the player's entertainment. Each environment is nothing but a winding corridor. The Revolution is the absolute opposite. The stakes of freedom, the scale of the conflict, the signs of angry rebellion being waged around you and without you, all of it suspends disbelief in a way that the by-the-numbers cliches of the first game never could. Without many words at all, just through environment and gameplay, they've created something that feels very concrete, something that I found absolutely compulsive to play. Furthermore, the character of the neighborhoods will change as your revolutionary percentage climbs. First, graffiti appears, and then people gathering in the streets, and then finally open defiance, smashing cars, lighting fires, kicking down KPA soldiers into unconsciousness. It's especially satisfying in the yellow zones. They have the most dramatic internal arc of revolution. You begin with just a small hideout and a couple of tiny opportunities to establish footholds in areas where the security is weak. From there, you attack more and more fortified targets and some miscellaneous targets of opportunity. It does get old in repetition, but the first few times that you save a line of civilians from the kind of execution that would have been seen during the bus ride in the original game, you get the impression that you actually are making some kind of a difference, even if all you're actually doing is adding a couple percentage points to your revolution. The difference isn't only that it's interactive and not scripted, it's that it truly is at the player's discretion. Maybe you're trying to get to the next mission undetected. You'll have to walk right by these people getting bags put over their heads, your own head pointing downwards to avoid the gaze of the KPA. Such a huge emphasis is placed on the free-form, open-world content that these larger themes feel like the window dressing that they are, and they don't threaten to interfere with the fun. On the contrary, actually, several meaningful tweaks to the portrayal of the KPA from the first game allows this second game to be both more straightforwardly fun and morally comfortable than the original's careless, nationalist approach to the themes. The best storytelling evolution over the first is in emphasizing the role of collaborators. In the game's introduction, you and some other resistance fighters are waiting for Walker, the charismatic leader of the revolution. The KPA raids your building instead. You're brought into a room for interrogation. The torturer who shows up isn't some kind of sneering racist caricature. He used to be an American, too. Now he's a cog in an evil machine. Right within the first 5 minutes of the game, it's clear that you're not fighting a race or a nation, you're fighting an idea, the idea of totalitarian oppression. You either work for it by collaborating or through inaction, or you resist. Action and bravery on the behalf of the oppressed matters more than any surface trait like heritage and race. As you take each neighborhood, your individual actions and the snowballing consequences of your victories embolden the people to rise up with you. Sure, you're the infinitely regenerating super soldier amongst them, but the reinforcement rhythms of the game make it clear that only the mass of the whole resistance coming together is enough to make a meaningful dent in the Korean occupation. But the game reaches a little too far when it tries to introduce moral complexity into the equation without the same kind of tonal freedoms found in the game mechanics. Like the first Homefront, this is a game of anti-heroes, although admittedly a much more likable and believable bunch of anti-heroes. Mostly. Again, the hothead character causes a lot of problems. About 10 minutes out from the scene with the KPA torture, Walker is captured and you're sent back to Resistance headquarters. The guards, a couple of local goons, figure you for a spy and hand you over to Dana Moore, who happens to be the Resistance's own torturer. She's in the process of threatening to cut your nipples off, for real, when in walks Jack Parrish, Resistance leader, who sorts it out for you. There's a lot to Jack, but not as much was done with his arc as there could have been. Parrish is a compelling character because he's obviously unqualified, performing above his experience. He's a local blue-collar type. He's older, he's bad at speeches, he makes bad tactical decisions. He makes good ones, too, enough to stay in charge, but he has a lot of flaws. Where Parrish falls flat and the game flounders is in not giving you any kind of voice to react to what he's doing, to approve or disapprove of his leadership. You've got a silent protagonist in Homefront: The Revolution. The most illustrative scene of why that's counterproductive to the storytelling is one where, after a tactical setback, Parrish demands that Sam Burnett, the game's Dr. Humanitarian Voice of Reason, allows weapons to be stored at his free clinics. Parrish bullies Burnett into allowing the weapons, and that's it. Everyone leans in real close to the player and tells you how it's going to go down. In the game's mechanical arc, you can go loud or you can go quiet. You can engage at a distance or right up close. You can pilot a remote-controlled bomb to blow up a gate, cause a distraction, and seize and reject it while all the guards are tied up on the other side of the compound, or you can just come in through the front and kill everybody. There is an approach to suit a variety of playstyles and moods, but not in the plot. In this game about newfound freedoms, you quietly do exactly as you're told, every time there's a story beat. Dana Moore's impulsive violence might warrant another chance to at least comment on what's going on, as Moore insists on more reckless assaults and then later stabs an important prisoner to death on live TV. Parrish and Moore have been waging their war for a long time, and it's damaged them both. It's valuable storytelling to portray that, but there's no balance without a voiced protagonist. You have a name, Ethan Brady, but you have no opinions, no values whatsoever. What do they think would have been taken away from the player if they had a protagonist who had concrete opinions on the unfolding developments? It doesn't even have to change the outcome, but when every player in the audience is supposed to think, hey, Jack, this plan of yours is a bad one and people are going to die, and then the moment passes when your character could naturally voice this concern in conversation without a hint of skepticism, it disconnects the player further. In a lot of games that are less inherently political, in games that do not incorporate moral ambiguity into the script, a silent protagonist can certainly stand in for the player, a blank slate on which any projected experience is valid. But Revolution is thematically a thing about deep personal conviction. Conviction so deep, you give up everything you have and risk life and limb in a bid for change and a better tomorrow. If Brady is a real character like everyone else, he surely has his own deep personal reasons. Not articulating those reasons doesn't allow the player to project their own, because we're not a part of this world. We have no history in it. We're participating in the revolution for entertainment reasons. A silent Brady is merely an absent Brady, a jagged hole carved out of every conversation that the player quietly participates in. The effect of up to 3 characters leaning in close to talk directly to your face feels weird, too. It feels weird because in a real back-and-forth conversation, nobody would be crowding you in like that to give you the scoop. They don't speak to each other like that, 3 gathering around one and getting up in each other's business. They speak to each other normally, dynamically, and for the most part, really articulately. The writing for the characters is strong, and the principal cast felt more casually genuine than many of the casts of games that the Revolution is derivative of. Which makes Brady's silence all the more irritating. If he had been as dynamic and flawed as the others, if he had actually rendered some kind of comment one way or another on events, and been as opinionated on the ethics of the revolution he's participating in as Moore and Burnett are, they would have actually had something with this game much more artistically interesting and complete. Of course, you've also got to consider the note from the game director. This game was already stretched to the absolute limits of its budget and developmental manpower to get out the door in the first place. So, what is the price of nuance? The literal monetary price in a game like this? It's easy to say, as a critic, let me choose between Moore's approach and Burnett's approach to Revolution, let me try to talk Parrish into leaning one way or the other, but when you consider what that would mean as a developer, I'm pretty much asking them to double the complexity of their story missions, to double the time and money it takes to put them in the game in the first place. A branching plot is an expensive plot. The more it branches, the more complex it is, the more it costs. The motion capture and facial detail of the characters is already high quality. You can almost hear the cash register chiming in the distance every time Parrish scowls. But there was never going to be any way they were going to make 2 versions of that scene just to satisfy my desire for ethical interactivity. But a voiced protagonist in a first-person shooter? That is a more reasonable request. You don't even have to animate your own face, and it would have solved so many of the frustrations and deficiencies in the narrative experience. Not all of them. While the mechanical pacing of the game is freeform and compelling, the narrative arc struggles with being almost as flat and frustrating as the original game's 6-mission gasoline heist. It's all centered around Walker, the charismatic leader who gets taken by the KPA in the introduction. About the first 2/3 of the game is organizing a rescue to try and take Walker back, but the final stage of that plan leads everyone into a really obvious trap. Walker appears on TV, asking the revolutionaries to stand down and give up. The KPA broke Walker. You've barely seen the guy. He's supposed to be a big deal, but when he's needed the most, he just isn't there. It's just you guys, the good old boys and vengeful women of the shattered Philadelphia. Which is a meaningful story beat. It sets Parrish up for his big moment where, after raiding City Hall and holding the mayor at gunpoint on live broadcast television, Dana Moore stabs the mayor in the ear out of revenge for some extremely specific past abuses she'd suffered at his hands. So their Walker-Mayor propaganda swap is a total bust, and now Parrish has to say something meaningful, even though he hates that shit. His speech is something I've been back and forth on. It's a bad speech. It's trite, it's overwrought, and as something that Parrish would say when put on the spot, feels about right. But as a climactic narrative moment with 29 hours of build-up, it is a hopeless clunker. In it, he says that no one can wait around for someone like Walker to save them. If you want something done, do it yourself. Liberate yourself. If you want to be free, you just gotta beat the shit out of the person who took those freedoms from you, because no one is gonna do it for you. This is totally in keeping with the script's themes, and is maybe the inevitable moral to come out of the plot, but it shows the pop cultural gap between Red Dawn's Cold War mentality and American identity today, sharper than anything else. Red Dawn is a little slice of American propaganda, sure, but in propaganda you find the most idealized version of the national character. It wasn't by mistake that the movie shows a small-town invasion and not a major city. This dynamic allowed the real victor of the movie to be the idea of what being an American means in opposition to being a Soviet. An idea that, in extraordinary circumstances, the inherent goodness and civic loyalty of even teenagers is strong enough to resist the cold aggression of tanks and armies. Obviously, this is both unrealistic and idealized, but like I said, it's aspirational. It shows a larger set of genuinely moral values, like standing up to save your loved ones even if it means danger to yourself, like endurance in the face of overwhelming opposition. And then it goes on to suggest that we all share these values by participating in the same culture and community as Americans. The kind of naked individualism of Parrish's approach is messier, maybe more realistic, but much less narratively satisfying in a story that's already got a cartoonishly evil oppressor. What's held up in opposition to totalitarianism in the game isn't so much democracy as just mob rule, the loudest voices in the room winning out, the angriest actions the most effective. That's how Parrish and Moore have accomplished their revolution, sheer force of anger and will. That anger is all that's left to define them when the game is done. Like Connor in the first game, both Parrish and Moore sacrifice themselves at the end, seemingly for no other reason besides that letting them live without a redemptive sacrifice would condone their violent excesses too much. Homefront the Revolution is a game that uses a Cold War us-versus-them frame without ever presenting a culturally coherent us. We are a mass of self-interested individuals, and though we may work in tandem, our own anger is all that sustains us, if you go by Parrish's speech. It's awfully out of step with the thematic goals of Red Dawn, but maybe it's an approach that's truer to how the American character really is now in 2016. There's some other stuff in the scene with the mayor that's really compelling, though, and cycle back to the themes of collaboration. The mayor lets you in on a secret. You're not the first city to resist. Every other city that has is a graveyard. If you succeed with this revolution, the KPA will kill everyone. They can't let the revolution spread. They won't. So, you get your victory, and it seems like the game's gonna end, but then the KPA begins gassing the city, using the Zeppelins to cloud dust poison over the broken skyscrapers and crumbling tenements. The collaborators you've run into are ultimately fighting for what's left of a status quo. They're already defeated, their nation is already dead, their independence is long over. They just don't want to lose the rest of their dignity, their lives. They don't want to risk what tiny scraps of familiarity are left of them. The most fascinating neighborhood of the game by far is the Yellow Zone that serves as the collaborators' sector. It stands in tremendous contrast to the war zones and tent cities you've come from. Here the streets are clean. Trees grow. Life goes on. Korean architecture has replaced the bombed-out rubble. The regime is dangling the most basic comforts of hearth and home like a carrot, and by the time you see the neighborhood, you can begin to understand why the people there would betray their fellows. They're tired. They're scared. They just want some tiny slice of normality, and here it is, a tremendously artificial but functional slice of normality in a very evil place. It also underlines the immorality of what the collaboration means. Self-interest, the same kind of self-interest that Parrish is actually playing to in his climactic speech, has led these people to ignore the cruelties inflicted on their neighbors. They feel conflicted, like they've done a hard thing and made a tough call, but they haven't. They've taken the easy way out. They've cut their own losses and shifted consequence onto the losses of others. As they move through the district, chaos grips the streets. Fights, fire, graffiti, gunfights. By the time you've raised your revolutionary percentage to 100, the neighborhood is as much a war zone as any other. You have not brought safety or civility to the neighborhood, but you did leave the gate open to let the war in. Bringing stability to the collaborator district was never the goal. Bringing honesty to the district was. These sorts of ruminations on revolution that the gameplay and environmental progression provoke are often much more satisfying and compelling than what they do in the main plot, which bounces from item to item without building much momentum. Then, when Walker turns out to be a bust, much of the script's efforts are rendered moot. The end feels abrupt, especially with no mechanical arc of change in the green zone like what happens in the yellow zone. Whatever climax the game was building to in the plot, the green zone was the climax being built to in the gameplay, and the game stops just short of it. Shooting down the blimps and stopping the gas attack is a good finale mission, but what the mayor said undermines its solidity. What's to stop the KPA from just nuking the city now that they've figured out that they've lost it? The note from the director promised that if you liked the game, this was just the beginning. There are 3 major pieces of DLC being made for Homefront: The Revolution, the first of which is already available. So it's likely many of these plot threads will be picked back up on across the new content. But who will play? Although the game's now been extensively updated for performance smoothness, on release it was a lot rockier on the technical side and left a poor impression for many people. Many players didn't get deep enough into the game to see where it started to become the most interesting, and those that did still had to contend with the poor, flat pacing and the lackluster end. Getting people to come back to a game they love is relatively easy. Getting people to give another chance to something that hit them as pretty mediocre the first time around is a hell of a lot harder. I had 0 expectations for Homefront: The Revolution going into it based on the original. I expected something empty and awful. Instead, I found a very good game buried under an avalanche of developmental difficulty and half-realized ideas. I'm curious if the DLC will be able to transform it into the complete vision the developers wanted on release, the game that the director said was yet to come. But even if the DLC doesn't explore the narrative themes in any more detail, exploring the mechanical systems, as derivative as they are, I think does warrant a return to the front. Thanks for watching. I want to take this time to thank the people who are making these videos possible by donating to me on Patreon. I want to thank by name all the people who are currently contributing $10 a month or more to help make these videos. People like Morton Scanning, Cameron Jackson, Eddie Burton, Carl Gleason, Silas Blatchley Henson, Josh Sparks, Ashley Rain, Martin Karsten, Michael Connon, Bob Belcher, Chris Larkey, Zach Z, Matthias Hellstrand, Daniel Hartnett, Red Wolf, Bradley Fisher, Q-Ray X, Scott Miller, Kim Winson, Charles Favreau, Carol Henderson, Rick Storr, Ray Sawyer, James, Jay Naylor, Matthew Mason, Thunder O'Brien, Jonathan Holder, Max Wellington, D-Stex, Rob Tackett, Angel-Headed Hipster, Daniel Mower-Myrie, Colin, Joshua Vivi, Pay, Dylan Sibley, Yuri Petnis, Wesley M., Sharif Kazemi, Harley McAvoy, I Cannot Fly, Brett Galmo, Colby Howard, David Reed, Divya Faust, Mary Ellen, Tim Marsh, Ryan Gunst, Sangustin, David Fry, Kevin Schaub, White Zero, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Aaron Albach, Martin Markov, Alexander Dmitriev, Joe Hewison, Aiden AK-47, Tim Moon, Brandon Boat, Kimmo Heikkinen, Ariel Badger Release, Jody Warren, Niels Backfrommer, Tizer Vicarian, Jeffrey Knutson, Paul Cocker, D, Kyle Brown, Will Wargrave, Galak, Sasha Aya, Jack Harvey, Jonas Martinson, Brad Wallace, Camel, Robert Glover, Jack Dawson, Alex Zalato, Josh Matthew, Brad Carr, Dewey, Preston Allen, Stephen Potyak, David Gilbreth, Brian Plockelman, Alexander Heavens, Devin Fitzpatrick, Matthew Zender, Trivium Art History, Jacob Robinson, Evan Hill, Pierce McBride, Ivan Buccio, Stephen Premmel, Connor Biblo, Andrew Schiffel, Chris Kaon, Lee Jones, Michael Atwell, Spyro Sedaris, David Carlson, Brad Smith, Cassie, Comfy Hat, Ron Gervais, Christian Zacharianson, Pat Hay, Soeb Sheik, Balder Carlson, Will Hooten, Nick Cole Hamilton, Jake Mays, Jake Brennan, Kevin DeBolt, Dalton Seiler, Dennis Clark, Ken Young, Niles D. McDonald, Alexander Leister, Nobody, Michael Benson, Kumaran Vijan, Justin Hughes, Igor Babiak, Brian Hill, Andrew Steele, Jared Meyer, and Andreas Larson. Thanks again to all of you and to everyone who donates smaller amounts, like everything helps and everything's going to good use. I appreciate it. Villains anymore, and framing China as a one-dimensional villain is a guaranteed method for a media company to lose international business. Some critics liked it, though. Homefront has a Metacritic average of 70, with 8 separate outlets giving it 80 or above. I spent a lot of time trying to puzzle out why. In some ways, this is a very detailed and meticulously constructed game. In other ways, it is guiltier of what people see as the prime excesses of Call of Duty, with scripted events outweighing tactical choice, with an obligatory vehicle level, with slow-mo room breaches, with death from above air support segments, than any single Call of Duty game ever was, because it's trying to outdo a bunch of Call of Duty games in one go, and failing at it spectacularly. It is so single-mindedly derivative that it slams the door shut on the fingers of the artistry that does earnestly try to slip through the cracks. Homefront doesn't trust the player to do anything themselves, and that's the biggest problem, mechanically at least. Call of Duty is infamous for big segments where follow, wait is the only mechanic in use. Homefront is a much worse offender. At 4 hours, it's about the shortest I've ever seen in a big-budget campaign shooter, and fully 1 to 2 of those hours is going to be predominantly follow, wait, interspersed with, in the other 2 hours, follow, clear arena, follow, wait. The levels are linear to the point of glaring cheapness, where they tether the player to an NPC just to make sure that the player winds their way through the most circuitous route possible to make the level seem larger than it is. That's supposing you don't straight up backtrack through portions of the level, too. Even though there are only 7 missions, almost all of them involve some degree of backtracking. If not obvious backtracking, then the kind I described earlier, where the linearity of progression curves you on Milius to come in and help with world building. He's credited with a script, but in a Gamasutra post-mortem on the game, it's made clear that Milius didn't actually write any dialogue for Chaos Studios. He was just an idea man, and a back-of-the-box bullet point feature. It suckered me in at the time. I wanted a Red Dawn game, and Homefront was being marketed as one. But it wouldn't reuse the Russians. Instead, the game would bend over backwards to make North Korea the villains. It kind of makes creative sense, seeing as North Korea is the last living example of a Soviet-style military dictatorship. China was floated around as an antagonist early on, but publisher THQ didn't want to hurt international sales or risk a rebuke from China's media bureaucracies. The Cold War's us versus them mentality is a distant memory now. Even though China and the US are competing superpowers with competing ideologies, there's too much economic interdependence to make the Red Dawn scenario Homefront's going for marketable to an international audience that, notably, does include the Chinese and not the North Koreans. It's strange to think of a game's plot being altered because it would be diplomatically rude in the real world, but that's exactly what happened. The funny thing is, Modern Warfare 2's stupid but simple tweak to the Russians, "Oh, they're ultranationalists, just a bunch of real jerks," works so much more casually than the convoluted chain of events that Homefront uses to make North Korea the successful oppressor of the American continent. A lot of idea man John Milius' concepts from Homefront would get rolled directly into the 2013 Red Dawn remake, which also framed North Korea as the aggressor, to just as awkward a critical reception of the idea. The Soviet-Korean swap was for the same reasons, too. Not enough of the audience even remembers the Soviets for them to be effective villains. Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. In this video I'm going to be taking a look at both Homefront games, both the 2011 linear shooter and the open world shooter from last year. Both games have the same theme, the same enemy, but they couldn't have more different executions and different results. Let's take a look. Homefront came out 5 years ago, but I'm still irritated about it. It's a derivative mess of bad ideas and worse implementation. The campaign is barely 4 hours long, and what little there is rips off Modern Warfare 2 shamelessly. This game came out in 2011, Modern Warfare 2 came out in 2009. Homefront is worse in every regard. It looks worse, it plays worse, and its haphazard and stunted plot makes even less sense than the convoluted nonsense in Modern Warfare 2. Each pull the same emotional thread, though. America is under attack, a catastrophic land invasion that'll have the player fighting in suburban streets and cul-de-sacs where "Remember the Taco King" is a rallying cry of 21st century patriot warriors. Modern Warfare 2 uses the Russians as the big scary invader, the same way the cult classic hit Red Dawn did in 1984. Homefront, though, tried to one-up them, and got the director of Red Dawn, John, from one side of the building to the other side later on, so that the space of the level is used with greatest resource efficiency. I've never seen a shooter before, or since, that has such a small number of long, convoluted missions. Functionally, you're just walking from one set piece to another while your companions argue gruffly about who's the maddest at the Koreans. The shooting is mechanically the same as Call of Duty in the flattest way possible. It copies the interface, copies the weapon variety and encounter types, like spawning enemies until an advancement point is reached, or having to snipe guards in a predetermined order, but it has none of the momentum of spectacle that many Call of Duty titles leverage from their level design. The intention is the same, but there are key differences in how the spectacle is accomplished that lets Call of Duty succeed. Call of Duty has huge set-piece moments that draw the player's attention by commanding it, visually. Effort is made to frame the combat landscapes against vistas the player comes across naturally that show you what's going on from a variety of angles. They put great detail into background environments, so there's a consistent feeling of environmental realism and specificity. It seems like you're in a unique place, and then you globetrot to many distinctive and detailed places in which to fire underbarrel grenades. Homefront, though, is much more limited in scope. It's got the town of Montrose, a survivalist camp, a helicopter patrol through central California, then the Golden Gate Bridge. That's it. Its shortness seems to have created a paranoia about the player's agency. If you let the player dictate the pace, they'll burn through the game way too quickly, probably closer to 2 hours than 4. So you are always tethered to your NPC companions, and at their mercy for advancing through the level. They will direct your attention to what to look at. They will literally tell you to slow down and pay attention to what the game wants to show you. They'll tell you when enemies stop respawning and when it's okay to move on. While the same criticism can be leveled against many individual moments in the Call of Duty franchise, in aggregate, they often allow for a much greater variety of approaches than anything in Homefront. It's not just linear, it is suffocatingly linear, even for a Call of Duty clone. It's a guided tour of violence, war crimes, and bargain basement gunplay. Follow weight is the biggest problem in the gameplay, but it's the biggest problem in the script as well. You have no character, no voice, no personality of your own in the game. You follow, and you wait. So the game presents you with ethical dilemmas, like your commanding officer Connor deciding to use white phosphorus shells on the enemy, which is a pretty serious war crime, and then everyone just rolls with it. Connor says it's necessary, so we're doing it. Brianna, your other main companion, does argue with him about it to try and represent the two sides of the burn people alive, don't burn people alive coin, but there's no choice involved. And the strange thing about it is that it's genuinely only for show, for the plot to get edgy and gritty, because it kills a parking lot full of North Korean soldiers, but you could have taken them all on yourself based on the game's internal logic of how many people the three of you routinely kill. The passivity of the player's role in both the plot and the gameplay really chafes. It's a dumb plan. It's a genuinely cruel and inhumane plan, and all it does is save you like 60 seconds of gameplay, and you're morally complicit in it. Some of the white phosphorus gets misfired and lands on a resistance position, killing many of them. You're complicit in the plot in that too. But Connor goes through the rest of the level not really too worried about it, with Rihanna chiding him ineffectually.